excited. You know, as some of you know, over the past couple of years, Destination Home has undertaken a number of different efforts to both advance principles of racial equity and also center the voices and experiences of those who have lived homelessness experience. And we've done that both internally within our organization, as well as endeavored to do that throughout the supportive housing system. And that's really why all of you are here today, because you are our partners in that system. And we want to support your work in also integrating these principles into your organizations. And we heard loud and clear from you guys that you agreed that this is important work and that you could use some support and resources. And so that's why we're here today. We're super excited to be joined by the Justice Collective and to be partnering with them on this. This is the first of many resources that we plan to offer and to bring to you all. And so with that, I'll just say that we're really excited to be learning with you and learning from you today. And that's it. I'll turn it back over.
Wonderful. So for those of you who may have just joined, make sure that you drop your organization name, your name, and anything else you want to share in the chat box. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Just a quick mention, we are recording this training, so folks who maybe couldn't make it will have access to it later. But the breakout groups that you all will be in aren't recorded. And so the main space will be recorded, but the breakout groups you'll be able to, have your conversations there and not worry about those being recorded. So hopefully that works for everybody. I'm gonna share my screen and for our conversation. So give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. We're good? Okay. Now, for folks who, we've all been in COVID times for a while now. And something that's really valuable for us as a team and as your facilitators is to get, visual communication throughout the day. So if, you are like, yes, that's like a concept that I am here for, you can either literally give a thumbs up, or you can use some of the features, and Sarah will talk more about those, but just want to, early requests to be as expressive as possible, because we can't be in person with you, so we can't feel your energy. And it's always nice to get a better sense of, or as good a sense as possible of how things are landing. So we'll talk more about the technology in a bit. Okay, so today we are really spending some time laying a foundational understanding and knowledge related to how to become more equitable, diverse, and inclusive organizations. Some of you are already on this journey. Some of you have been on it for a while. Others are just getting started. We recognize that you're all bringing your own lived experiences, but also the experiences that you have in the work that you do into this space. And so just an early invitation to contribute and bring in your perspectives. They're so meaningful. And if some of the content feels, old hat to you, that you've had exposure to it before, that's cool. We're trying to play towards, middle level so that everyone has something valuable that they can take and leave the training with. And so you'll have plenty of time in small group breakouts to bring in those perspectives, and we certainly invite all of your rich lived and learned expertise into the training space. So what's our agenda today? Welcome and introduction. So we're in the midst of the welcome. We've done introductions. We'll do an opening exercise, and then spend some time just really quickly giving an overview around the technology and community agreements. We'll provide some framing for our day and our intentions for the day. And then we're gonna have a conversation about some grounding terms and concepts that are valuable for cultivating a deeper understanding of these issues and inside of your organizations, but also just generally building some of that foundational knowledge that will better equip you to advocate for equity, diversity, inclusion inside of your organizations, right? We'll watch a couple videos, we'll have break, we'll have breakout discussion. We'll talk about, why racial equity versus more general definitions of equity. And then we'll have some breakout conversation, share back, and we'll wrap up. So it's a pretty full agenda for 2 hours, but we're really looking forward to the conversation that we are going to have today. A little bit more about TJC, just so you can understand our approach to this work. As I said, I'm one of the co-founders. We're based in Oakland, California. I myself live in New Orleans. We've got a couple of folks who are based in other parts of the country, and we're a 100% woman of color owned company. We are a collective model, which means we have our core staff who are full-time employees with us, and then we work with a wide variety of consultants and on different kinds of projects. And so Sarah's one of our senior consultants that has been working with us for a couple of years now. And it allows us to work across all different sectors with all, inside a multitude of organizations and institutions, and bring a rich, variety and multiplicity of knowledge, expertise, and experience. I myself am an urban planner by training. I used to work in the planning department in San Francisco, and actually was the person who initiated the Racial and Social Equity Initiative in that department, and was a part of the early cohort of folks in this city to start to tackle and build racial equity action plans. And so my exposure and experience with housing, comes not only from, that experience, but other work, partnering and working at Urban Habitat, which is, again, based in Oakland, but has spokes throughout the Bay Area, and a few other organizations, Green Lining and others. And so I may have interfaced with some of you before. If I have, it's good to see you again. And TJC has had the opportunity to work with a number of housing organizations. And so we're trying to bring, all of that into our conversations today. And so feel free to reach out with questions as we continue our conversation. This is Sarah and I. We will guide you through this day together, this training together. Sarah, do you want to add anything else about your background or experience, or do you want to keep moving forward?
We can keep it moving. That's great.
All right. And so we are going to start with an opening exercise. I've already been talking for 10 minutes. I'd rather you all hear from each other. And so I'm going to break you out into breakout groups, and you're going to have some conversation about how do you define home. You'll be in pairs. You can define it in any way that makes sense. And so I'm going to go ahead and break us out. Think about maybe where you currently are, if there are other aspects of home that are related there. And we'll spend about 6 minutes or so in these breakout groups where you have a chance to meet and engage with one another.
I particularly want you to name the bioregion that you're in, the watershed region that you're in, and name the indigenous land that you're on as part of this exercise.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm just getting your breakout rooms ready, and we will spend 6 minutes there, almost to 2 pairs. There we go. Okay, let me go ahead and break you out. Make sure that everyone is...
Let me do a quick explanation. I got a request. A bioregion is how you name the biodiversity in your area. So every area has what's called a bioregion, and it can contain multiple ecologies, but it's a technical term. And a watershed is simply like where all the water comes from and is going. So within Santa Clara County, there are quite a few watersheds, and your indigenous land is named by the historical tribe that lived there. So if you need help or resources to do that, just flag us and we can send you some links, but you can also use Google if you don't know, or talk to each other.
And then we have someone on the phone, and I want to make sure that you get where your face is, assuming that you're on video and you called in. So if you called in, can you let me know what name I should be looking for to move you into a group? It's a 415 number. Maybe they hung up. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and open rooms. Everyone should have a partner. If you don't, come back to the main room and I'll put you into a group. So we'll see you back here in about 6 minutes. How do you define home?
So that was my guess.
Some legacy, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Ohlone area is a large area in the Bay Area. So if you were going to guess one, that would probably be the one.
Safe one to guess.
Okay, we're almost all back. So thanks for doing that. I know that was probably like very new for some of you, and I wanted to just provide a few resources. So if you want to dig into that more, you can. So there's a great map of native lands, and that's like throughout the whole country. Some information on San Jose. Sorry, I'm having a hard time. There we go. It's a delayed, sorry, I linked those twice. And really the exercise was meant to expand your ideas of home. So especially if you're homeless or thinking 10 years from now, like our ideas about home are maybe not going to be restricted to the boundaries of our neighborhood or our city, even certainly not our residence, and maybe even not our nation state. And we'll be looking more towards different ways of framing in the context of global warming about like our ecological home and how to care for it. So that was the way to deepen our ideas about where we are and our relationship to that place.
Any reflections from your groups that anyone wants to share out?
I'll say that from my from our group, we didn't even discuss what home was. We were so intrigued by watersheds, bioregions, and maps that's all we did. so that was it was fun. Thank you.
Same. The one thing I did notice is I've definitely have seen that folks are recognizing the indigenous land that they're on a lot more now. Like even I was telling Tony that on Instagram, folks are using that as their location. But the watershed and the bioregion, that was totally new to me. So yeah, we spent most of our time trying to figure out where we were.
And did you guys, I mean, you're all in Santa Clara County, so that was part of it, is to share like, oh, we're all in the same like sort of basin.
What my group discovered was what we came with home was with a place to feel safe and secure and comfortable. You know, we were both from the same area. So.
Fantastic.
Any last reflections?
It's a bunch of info for later if you want to dig it.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again and we'll talk about the next little piece here.
Yeah, so we switched some things around. This probably would have been useful like 5 minutes ago, but obviously try to use video, keep muted. You already figured out how to enter your breakout group, clicking the button. We suggest using gallery view so you can see everybody. And always just direct message us. You can pick everyone or our name to message us with any questions or private messages. Moving on. So this is some community agreements as we move through our work here in the next hour and a half. Just be willing to try on some ideas, new ways of doing things that you might not be familiar with. Practice self-focus. Just speak about your own experience respectfully. Understand the difference between intent and impact and try to acknowledge that impact. Practice a both and. So that's, you know, everybody has different realities and different experiences. So you're adding your own to someone else's. Refrain from blaming or shaming self and others. So practice giving skillful feedback. Move up and move up. So if you tend to be, well, we got the results back from the pre-survey, so thank you for filling that out. And 72% of you are both introvert and extrovert, so you're ambiverts. I relate. Danny's a full extrovert, so. But if you tend to hang back in our breakout sessions or even asking questions, then move up. Try to reach out and push past push past that comfort zone and speak up. And if you tend to speak a lot and ask questions and are usually really engaged, try to hang back a little bit and give everyone space to join in. Practice mindful listening. So try to avoid planning what you're going to say. We want to do active, deep listening. And confidentiality. We are recording this, but it's really just for teaching purposes. So especially in your breakouts, you can be candid and speak from the heart. And you can always have the right to pass if you are not comfortable saying anything.
How many of you use community agreements in meetings that you have, or maybe in your communities? Yeah. There's such good rules for life, right? Like I think about what does it take to have conversations around challenging topics or topics that can be challenging or sensitive or personally lived and experienced. And these are such good just practices generally, particularly the ones related to intent and impact. That's a big one, right? I'm sure we all have experience with someone's initial reaction to some harm or something that they said wrong. I didn't mean to, right? And so just recognizing that the impact is what we want to focus on in these sorts of conversations. And then also just the both and. I'm just lifting up a couple of these both and, right? So affirming someone's experience and instead of butting, adding your own perspective to that is transformative in many kinds of relationships, including, you know, those with family, friends, and partners. So these are rules for life. I'm happy to talk about the stretch zone. And so we are entering into these conversations more often in the workplace than usually, right? Depends on obviously your workplace, but you know, when we think about what does it take to be an effective advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion, one of the critical skills and practices is building resilience to discomfort, right? If you're someone who comes from a community that's been marginalized by systemic oppression, so if you hold you know, an identity as a person of color or someone who's a LGBTQ or you know, has experienced homelessness or you know, is otherwise marginalized, right, by these various systems that we'll talk more about, you're probably used to being resilient to discomfort, right? You actually get a lot of practice having to you know, show up even when everything is keeping you from showing up, right? And so this is an invitation for all of us, but particularly for folks who may not get as much practice in being resilient to that, to really spend time in this stretch zone. So if you think about, like, here, I'm safe. I'm not saying anything challenging or hard. I'm really not going that deep. Or here, I'm freaking out. I've said too much. My face is getting hot. My stomach hurts. I'm trying to run away. I'm going to get off this meeting right now, right? don't necessarily need to go to the panic zone, but look for opportunities not only in our training space, but as you bring these practices back to your organizations, to really spend time in that stretch zone and to invite others into that stretch zone as well, right? And so any of the things that we expose you all to today are also just tools that you can bring back to your own organizations, right? So as we're talking about these things, think like, oh, that might be something I want to incorporate into check-ins with, you know, my direct reports or my community members or whatever that looks like, right? And so yeah, so the stretch zone, we're going to spend our time there today. Sarah, do you want to share a bit about what we heard from folks?
Yes, thanks for filling out that survey. It was super helpful to understand and get a baseline from where everyone's coming from. We heard that you're concerned about pay inequities, especially for Black and Latinx staff and women. We heard that you have some challenges around how to address situations where a client behaves in a racist way towards staff or volunteers. We heard that there's a need for establishing buy-in for EDI work internally in the organization and externally in terms of your programming, and include the voice of clients and consumers in that lived experience. And having services available in a more equitable fashion for people to access during COVID. Of course, there are multiple layers of crises that are happening right now. It's a pandemic, there's bad air quality, all these things are just layering and layering impacts. So you guys are first responders, essential workers, you're on the ground. And so we recognize that that's intersecting with the equity, diversity, and inclusion work as well, and having disparate impacts on your staff and the people that you serve. So, you know, we want to definitely hold that you all are coming to this with different goals that you want to learn. And as Danielle mentioned, we're kind of trying to hit a middle. Some are focused on the organization, some are focused on the service, some are focused on the structural aspects, some are focused on the personal and interpersonal. So we're going to try to touch on a variety of training material that can get at some of that. Also, I forgot to mention in the tech, if you click on participants, you can, you know, raise your hand and you can have some access there around, you can raise your little blue hand. And if you click on reactions, you can do like a clap or a thumbs up. So that'll help us like see if you guys are with us or not. Thanks, Danielle.
So in terms of our learning outcomes for today, these are the two that we're focused on. So, you know, obviously the needs are really great, right? The needs inside your organizations systemically, so some of the things around pay equity, right? We have challenges that we're individually facing, right? We have challenges that our members of our community are facing, right? Our clients and others in our networks. And so we can't tackle all that today with you, right? But what we wanted to do was to build some foundational knowledge of some of the key historic and also present contexts of the implications of inequity in housing, both in the context of Santa Clara County, but also just in the broader context of, you know, historic federal policies that have shaped our country, and that maps right on down to what we're struggling with right now, right? And then also start to understand what are some of the key terms, what are some of the grounding terms that help us to understand the problem together, so we can also solve and create some solutions because we're speaking the same language, right? And so that's where we're starting. The other thing that we wanted to incorporate into our time together, which Sarah was just alluding to, is, you know, there's the interpersonal aspect of this as well, right? And so we'll just touch on and give you a chance to talk a bit about emotional intelligence and empathy towards the end, because that's such a key skill to support you all in this work. I'm sure that there's actually folks who have really high emotional intelligence and empathy on this call, because you wouldn't be good at your job if you didn't. But having more knowledge, and I'll talk more about this when we get to that section, about why it's important and what it looks like, is what we'll aim to do. So that's also part of what we'll touch base on today. A little bit about our theory of change at the Justice Collective that really helps us consider the complexity of the challenges that you're facing in context. And so when we think about broader structural inequity, right? So when we see the life expectancy of whole groups have 20 years between them, or the wealth gap, or all these other broader structural inequities, what we know is that they're really the result of inequities in different institutions in the aggregate. So when there's inequity in housing, is there inequity in housing? Maybe a little inequity in housing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, a little bit. Both historically and currently, right? And we look at further inequities in education, right? As a field, as a sector, as a system and institution. When we conflate those two institutions together, that's when we get broader systemic inequities, right? And so we can layer onto that healthcare, we can layer onto that the criminal justice system, and we'll actually give you all a chance to think about that in a bit. But just the recognition that structural inequity is driven by inequities at the institutional level, right? And so what that means then is that when we are tackling these issues as members of an institution, so in this case, housing, right? We have to actually look across institutions to see where there's opportunities to increase equity, right? And so this might get us thinking about who are some of the other organizational partners outside of housing that might be a piece of the puzzle. And for folks who are case managers or work directly with clients, you know that it's never just housing, right? It's housing plus X, Y, and Z, right? And so if we want to solve these broader structural inequities, we have to identify both in our work, but also in the work of others, where we can get folks moving in the right direction, right? What that also means is that the culture of our organizations really functions in a similar fashion. So the way that I interact with Maggie or with Katie or with Karen, right, in my organization is what drives the culture of an organization. So if I'm not showing up with empathy, if I'm not showing up with a thoughtful consideration of the experiences that folks are having or my own experiences, and that's happening in a multitude of places, that's how we get the culture of an organization, right? And so what that also means is that we have an individual role and responsibility to embody practices, to live practices that drive equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so the work that we are tackling with you all, the conversation that we want to start to have really is, how can we think about both the larger context, this larger system that we're situated in, and also start to think about what our individual role is in that larger system. And so it's a lot to hold at the same time. You don't have to hold it all the time at the same time, but just remembering that these things are not separate focuses. They're actually all a part of the work. Does that make sense? Can I get some nods if you're picking up what I'm putting down? Okay, cool. So with that said, before I move forward, any questions, any early reflections before we tackle some grounding terms? And I'm going to take a sip of water because I need to hydrate. Okay, so we'll move forward then. We think it's always important to ground ourselves in some terms, right? We talk about things all the time. This goes for, stuff related to equity and race, but also just generally speaking, the word home and what that means, right? And so the more that we can develop some shared understanding, some shared language about terms, the better equipped we are to work in collaboration and to really truly hear each other, right? And so in a moment where we are experiencing the acute state of multiple injustices, including, you know, race, but many, many, many others, right? Our national dialogue, our local dialogue doesn't always capture with clarity what we're trying to say and what we're trying to talk about, right? Which is one of the reasons why we have a hard time moving forward together. And so just some grounding terms related to both race and ethnicity. So race, you'll hear this all the time, is a socially constructed way of grouping people based on skin tone or other physical attributes, right? What we don't want to focus too hard on is that it's socially constructed, because what that leaves out is that it has meaning, right, in our society. And so while there's no biological basis for race, so we are not different at the DNA level, because of the way that our society is constructed, it has meaning, right? And it has meaning in very specific ways, both at the interpersonal level, but also at the systemic level as well. And so sometimes the conversation stops at, well, race is a social construct, so it doesn't matter, right? Well, it does matter, actually. It shouldn't, but it does. So we're gonna deal with what's real. And what's real is that race in our society matters. When we layer on ethnicity, right, which is even more complex. So I'm thinking Santa Clara County, I'm thinking about the variety of, you know, demographic, you know, diversity that you all have down there, right? It's important that we also understand how ethnicity layers on top of this as well. And so ethnicity, which you can have both a race and an ethnicity at the same time, is really more about a shared history, culture, language, food, belief system, your mythology, so your origin story of your people is shared, right? It tends to be passed on, you know, through the generations, right? And so, you know, race and ethnicity are certainly not mutually exclusive, but they can complicate things when we're looking at data or when we're having conversations about you know, someone's lived experiences or what their needs are, right? And so just want to provide a little bit of context on those two terms. Are there any questions, or does that all make sense? Give me some nods, some thumbs up, some, okay, cool. All right. So I want to actually go to culture before I talk about structural racism, because it's a big one. So like, what is culture? So I just said ethnicity, you know, often there's a shared culture associated with, you know, ethnic identity. So what does culture mean? So culture really is the knowledge, the experiences, the beliefs, the values, the attributes, the meanings, the hierarchies, notions of time. That's a big one, right? And spatial relations, what the universe exists. Culture is everything, right? And culture is transmitted. And so when we talk about how the culture of an organization functions, right? That's something that's passed along. You might not have a handbook that says, this is our organizational culture, or you might, whether or not that's truly how, you know, culture is expressed inside your organization depends, right? This also functions at the societal level as well. And so where we place value, where we prioritize, all of that has to do with culture. And so it's important to remain attentive to culture as well. Okay, I'm gonna bring us back to structural racism. So we've talked about race, right? We've talked about ethnicity, and we've talked about culture. And so for us, when we are grappling with equity, diversity, inclusion, we recognize that structural racism or racialized oppression, which we're just going to call racism, is really at the heart of a lot of inequities that we experience and have experienced historically and presently, not only as a country, but also as a global family, right? Yes, this PowerPoint will be available, so you'll get all this stuff. Don't worry about it. And so structural racism, now that we have a sense of what culture is, well, we have a sense of what race is, structural racism really is the history, culture, the ideology, public policies, which we'll talk about, institutional practices, and also personal behaviors and beliefs and how they interact to maintain a hierarchy. So in the context of the United States, we know that historically and presently, there are systems and structures that concentrate resources, access, value, beauty, right? Those standards often are accessible to one or a few groups and not other groups, right? And so to make that even more plain, the experiences of Black and Indigenous folks, people of color in this country are very different than the experiences of white folks, right? Because of these larger systemic structures that have been in place for centuries now. You know, we go all the way back to the genocide of Indigenous people in the US, right? And then we layer on top of that the way in which Black folks were, you know, property and enslaved for centuries, right? And then we have the experiences of, you know, Japanese internment and the Chinese Exclusion Act and right? 9/11 and how that shaped the experiences of folks from the Middle East in this country. And so we have centuries and generations of racialized oppression, structural racism, and those absolutely interact with our housing system, right? And so we're going to talk a bit more about some very specific historic moments that have shaped our housing system that we are all experiencing today. Okay, so how does race differentiate from discrimination, racism? How is it differentiated from discrimination and prejudice? So a lot of times in our conversation, our national dialogue around race, when you try and talk about racism, someone will say, well, I've never discriminated against someone in my life, or everyone can be racist, or, right? There's all these talking points that come up. The distinction between discrimination, prejudice, and structural racism really is power, right? And so as an individual, I can certainly be prejudiced against other people, regardless of my racial identity, right? The distinction is that prejudice is not backed up by structures and institutions, right? There is not power associated with my prejudice or my discrimination. And I'll give you a very clear example of that. And so, I don't know how many of you are on Facebook. I haven't been able to cut the cord yet, but I'm sure you've witnessed, you know, comments or, you know, comment sections or statuses that you're like, ooh, nope, delete, no longer friending that person. And so a few years ago, I remember seeing a post that had been, you know, it wasn't on my friends group, but this woman had posted something extremely racist, and people had found where she worked. They're like, looked at her profile and saw that she was a loan officer for housing at a bank, right? And so she held racist views towards Black people, which is problematic in and of itself. She also had an institution that she was a part of that could determine if a family was able to build wealth, right? And so she was an individual who held a racist view in a system that also was already set up to exclude certain groups, right? And so that's how both the systemic and the individual intersect, right? So power, right, and the institutions and the structures is what differentiates discrimination or prejudice from structural racism. So hold that really clear when you get into these conversations with family or coworkers about, is it racism or is it something else, and where do we attack the problem, right? And so for us, our conversation is about attacking the problem at the root, and the root is the system, is the structure. And so that's where we're going to spend most of our time today, is talking about structural inequity. Are we good on, are we clear on those terms? Is that landing for y'all? Okay, great, thank you. All right, So how many of you have seen this graphic that differentiates between equity and equality before? Okay, some folks have, some folks haven't. And so oftentimes when we're doing work that serves the public, like I said, I worked in the planning department in San Francisco, and a lot of the early conversations when we were first starting to tackle equity when I joined the department were about, well, we're public servants, and so we have to give everybody the same thing, right? Everyone has to get the same because we're public servants. However, what we knew is that people needed different things, and they needed different things for a variety of different reasons, right? And so when we think about our community engagement activities, or how we communicate, or the channels and the pathways that we use to communicate with folks, people have different needs, right? And so really the difference between equality and equity is that when we apply an equity lens, when we're thinking from an equitable place, we give everyone what they need, not everyone the same. And the reason we do that is because if we think about the grass on this graphic as historic injustice or historic inequity, or the way that systems and structures have kept people from resources for centuries, right? We see that not everyone is starting out from the same place, right? We know that to be true. And when we think about the fence, right, as current structural inequities, so we can even look, there was a report released recently where people of color are shown significantly less homes by realtors than their white counterparts, even at the same income level. So we have current structural inequities that are in place. And so when those two things conflate, we have different outcomes. Some people can see over the fence, some people can't see over the fence, right? And so when we think equitably, we focus the most resources, the most attention where the biggest gaps are. That is what equity means. And so you'll see here, in order to have the same outcomes, people needed different things. And now they can all see over the fence because we are putting appropriate attention and allocating appropriate resources where it's needed the most. Yeah, makes sense? Cool. Okay. So how do we get here? How did we get where we are now? We're gonna watch a short video. It's by PBS, and then we'll come back and have a little bit of discussion. So I'm gonna press play. You all should be able to see it. We should be good. We can hear it. Okay.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans, or the backing for loans, to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
To Levittown, and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other Black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me looked around and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit, struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. The same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth. And on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
All right. How many of you have been affected or your family has felt the impacts of redlining? So everyone should be raising their hand right now, because the fact of the matter is that our neighborhoods are historically shaped by that public policy. And so everyone who's on this call right now, if you live in a neighborhood in America, in the US, your neighborhood has been shaped by redlining, right? If you actually look at a map, I'll use Oakland because I know that for a fact. If you look at a redlining map of Oakland during, where it showed the neighborhoods that were redlined and which ones weren't, and you look at current demographic spread in Oakland in particular, you will still see that people of color and Black folks in particular are still concentrated where? West Oakland and East Oakland, right? And so redlining was outlawed during the Federal Housing Act. You know, what year is it now? I can't even know what year it is now, 70 years ago, right? But you still have persistent residential segregation across this country. In every major metropolitan area in the United States, you have persistent racial segregation, right? On top of that, if you think about predatory lending, which was a huge cause of folks being pushed out of home ownership, right? 20 years ago, I guess 15 years ago, 10 years ago, what is time? You layer a map of foreclosures over redlining maps, and you'll often see the same concentration of foreclosures in neighborhoods that were traditionally redlined. And so what you have is multiple touch points in our housing history as a country that have not only first kept people from accruing wealth, which allows you to have some level of stability in your home, in your housing situation via historic redlining, right? And then you have subsequent other public policies, the deregulation of the housing market that further, right, deepened that chasm around home ownership. And we know that home ownership is just a part of the very complex puzzle that is the housing ecosystem and housing system more broadly. But as we all know, homeowners have more rights than renters do, right? And so for the folks that you're serving, for folks that you're engaging with, for the communities that, you know, are either on the, you know, cusp of experiencing homelessness or are currently experiencing homelessness, so much of it has to do with the inability to access and build sustained wealth and income and home ownership because of public policies like this one, right? And so when we're thinking about the solutions that our organizations are tackling and take on related to homelessness, related to poor quality housing or overcrowding in housing, you know, it started long before this with, you know, genocide of indigenous peoples and a number of different moments in our shared history. But this was a really critical missed opportunity to actually build wealth amongst GIs coming back from the United States, where, you know, whole groups of people, and in this case, you know, Black folks and other people of color, were kept from that shared prosperity. And that still continues today. And it's one of the biggest reasons why we have the wealth gap. It was actually during this time. We know this is a long training and we want to give you all a bit of a break. So we're gonna do a 5-minute biotech break, bathroom, email, whatever. And we'll see you back here at 1/4 all right?
And I was really not too familiar with what that meant, but I've heard of it, but I was never really educated around it. And I think that is just so like stunning and heartbreaking that even we're just not educated in our school systems, right? Like, how come I didn't know about redlining and how, you know, our neighborhoods were segregated? We kind of just we're like, oh, this is how it is, let's just continue, when really that's really horrible. You know, I think we need to know our nation's history, and I think everyone kind of agrees that the U.S. education system really kind of glamorizes U.S. history, and there's a lot of stories that we're not told, and the history is not told to us, and I think that's just really horrendous, and I think that needs to change going forward. We shouldn't be, you know, hearing about this as adults and in their workspace. So yeah, that was just what I was thinking about.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, imagine if you didn't know that history, your view of people is very different, or can be, right? If we don't have a shared understanding. Whereas, you know, if you have a family member or your grandparents or parents who experienced it firsthand, and you know that, right, then you might think you'll have more context for what we're experiencing today. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Go ahead, Ingrid, did you want to share?
I was just thinking just how we're finding the rates, especially in Santa Clara with COVID, directly correlated to the areas that were redlined. And we also just find the housing inequalities in that area. So just as you were saying earlier, how it affects all aspects of our lives, not just housing, right? All of it's related to housing, our health, our well-being, our mental stability. Yeah. And it's historical. So I think until we all know about it and change it, and until we change the current market, it's, it's not much to do. It's not going to change much.
Right. Yeah, it's historic and it has current implications. And then there are even more structures and inequities, right? That is a perfect segue. Thank you, Ingrid, for that, because that is absolutely, I want to bring us to our breakout group because I want us to kind of lean into that. And if the other two who raised their hand can hold it until we do another share back, that would be great. Okay, so I want to share my screen again because we want you to get into small groups and have some additional discussion. And so the point that Ingrid just made, can you all see my screen? We're good on that. The point that Ingrid just made about the fact that these institutions, and I'm using institution kind of broadly defined, so healthcare, education, etc. Broadly defined, interact, right? And they create outcomes that we all witness in a variety of different ways. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get into groups of 3. And we're going to give you a chance to have some conversation about, consider, and we'll give you a list of institutions to consider. The interaction, well, first, what are the inequities in that non-housing institution, right? So we're going to start there, non-housing related. And then how does it interact with housing and homelessness, right? And then how do those inequities impact the lived experiences of the communities that you serve? And I think it's important, there's an important opportunity to consider how those experiences differ, if they do, depending on the racial or ethnic group that someone is a part of, right? And so we see that the institutions, this public policies that were created were explicitly excluding Black people. And then by extension, it actually excluded a lot of other non-Black people of color, right? Are you seeing inequities and dynamics related to race, right? So how certain folks are experiencing them, versus others. And so ignore the kind of group thing here because we're going to have more than 5 groups. But these are some of the potential institutions, broadly defined, that I would love for you to have some conversation about in your group. If you want to take a few notes to be able to share back, that's fine, but don't feel the need to, take copious notes. This is more for you to apply this lens to think about the interaction between housing and other institutions, other sectors. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So Sarah, can you just paste the questions into the chat box from that previous slide? And then I'm going to go ahead and get you into your get you set up for your breakout groups. So just a moment. And just so you know, when you get into your breakout group, you can actually just click the chat box again because it'll go away. If you click the chat box, you can see what was left in there from the larger group. So just know that if you want to access those questions, they'll still be there. Okay, let me get you into groups. Are there any questions about the exercise? Okay. Looks like there aren't any. Just doing a scroll through to make sure that we mostly have groups of 3. Let me see here. bear with me. It's always super fun. Zoom.
We'll have about 10 minutes. Is that right, Danielle?
Yep,
Okay.
10 minutes. Okay, so one last thing, and then I will put you into your groups. Any other questions? No, we're good. And you're all just gonna bear with me while I get you situated. Okay, that should be good. All right, I'm gonna break you out now, and we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes. You may be in a pair, so if you are, it's the two of you talking. All right. Okay. There we go. All right.
You can refresh. I fixed some of the slides.
Okay. Had you like made a virtual whiteboard and stuff? I didn't want to get into all that. If you didn't, I'm glad you didn't. Okay.
I didn't, because I asked, like, should I? And I didn't hear anything. I was like, all right, let's.
I'm glad that you didn't. I didn't want you to. It's too much. Like, I don't mean to do that. I think the discussion itself is.
Yeah, and I mean, they're more active and engaged than Spur. I don't know if it's because you're friendlier or.
I'm plenty friendly on Spur. I'd be making jokes and everything.
No, but I think like you're just particularly on right now. It's like good. What's Shanice doing? Why are we recording?
Welcome back. Looks like that's just about everybody. How were your conversations? Oh, wait, just kidding. There's way more people coming. I wondered. I was like, I don't think there was only 29. Did we lose half the people? Am I that boring? Oh my goodness. But no, it's just taking a while. Okay, now we've got everybody back. Would love to hear from a few of you about what came up in your conversation. And then for the folks who didn't get to share during our last share back, feel free to raise your hand again. So if you can use the raise your hand feature, that will help us make sure that we get through to everybody. Jeffrey, you want to get us started?
Yeah, I was with Helen and Diana, and I mentioned one thing I was going to say before, which is that I've been in the industry for 25 years, and we just write color of law. And I mean, I've had a little bit of exposure from Paul Turner at the Greenlining Institute before that, but there were years and years and years where people just did not understand the systemic policies that we had to exclude minorities from wealth creation in America. It was so eye-opening and so unbelievable that such a gigantic fact wasn't known, you know? And so I mentioned an example of environmental injustice where we had housing in Florida built over a waste dump in an area that was terrible. You know, Helen talked a little bit about how she experienced folks who didn't understand that there was an educational disadvantage because of property tax rolls, and the fact that you have higher income neighborhoods that get better quality schools just because they have the resources. And you know, and Diana and I both were sharing around the planning department. Her experience in terms of education was similar to mine, that just nobody was talking about this, you know, 10, 15 years ago. They just were not. So there were a whole bunch of things around public health, environmental justice, just structural racism. We've touched a little bit on just the fact of incarceration and how that affects tenant selection. So it was a good discussion, I think.
That's good. Thank you so much. That's such a good book. Actually, when I was in the planning department, we had like a book club to have different, conversations about and discussions about that book. Other share backs. Yeah, Ingrid. Bring snacks because the author has a lot to say for sure. Are there other reflections? You can use the raise your hand feature. If you can't figure that out, you can just unmute. What institution did a few of you can put in the chat box or speak up? Did you choose criminal justice system or health? It's a big one.
I'll go and I'll kind of share. It was Hong, myself, and Lily Beth. Hong is with the Office of Supportive Housing, and Lily Beth is with YWCA, and I'm with Life Moves organization. We're all sector partners in trying to either address homelessness, housing, or domestic violence. And an area of topic that we talked about was education, and how if people don't have that security or that safety of having a stable place to live, then the last thing they can think about is receiving adequate education. And America is heavily based in having education to career success or to generate generational wealth. So we kind of also talked about how like interconnected housing, education, the criminal justice system are also interconnected, that when you're trying to address one issue, it often seems that you shut off the faucet there and then it overflows into another area. So it's like super, it's detrimental that we like kind of address everything at once. And so that way we can create like that safety net to where people can succeed. But it really starts with dismantling this white dominant perspective.
Yeah. Which is one of the reasons why some folks are just getting exposure to this content right now, right?
Yeah.
Who writes the history books, right?
Yeah.
One or two final thoughts on or sharebacks from your discussion, and then we'll shift to our next section.
I spoke with Lee, and we talked about mainly public health. And I think one of the points that resonated with both of us was the impact in mental health. I feel like all inequities in any aspect of society, whether it's housing, politics, tech industry, will affect public health. I feel like everything kind of falls under it. But one of the aspects of public health that is often underrated, it's mental health. And one of the topics that Lee brought up was the adverse childhood experiences, and how that really has a significant impact on the inequities that we live with today.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of a podcast I listened to about structural racism, and this podcaster was saying that it wasn't a thing, right? And then there was this historian that was talking about how Black experiences in slavery, segregation, in the Black Wall Street had such a significant impact on our reality today that even if we wanted to redistribute the wealth and make it even so that a Black wealthy person would have as much wealth as a white wealthy person, the next 2 generations in the future wouldn't catch up if we tried to keep redistributing the wealth. So it just had like this huge impact on mental health and adverse childhood experiences, and the historical roots of our people, whether we're Black, Latino, or Asian, or whatever, have a significant impact, so much so that we may not really be able to achieve true equity. And that just kind of blew my mind for a minute.
Yeah, because the hole that we're digging out of is so deep, right? It's also why you'll see the kids of middle-class Black folks often end up in a lower income bracket than their parents, because the systemic, you're continuously trying to dig yourself out of the hole, right? And why we like that video about redlining also is because it points towards this opportunity in our country's history to, again, build wealth, right? And so when we think about how our white families often, as a collective, able to finance the education of their kids' higher education, it's usually through their mortgage, right? That's what it was saying, is that folks could then, their kids didn't have to take out student loans necessarily. They could just take out a mortgage on their house and or sell their house and use the equity that they put into it to then send their kids to college. And obviously each individual family, is different, but collectively, right, there's a larger proportion of white families that were able to do that, right, with their kids. And so you have, disparities in student loan debt and all kinds of stuff that are racialized as well. Ooh, so much to say.
Ari had a comment.
Ari, yeah, and then we'll transition. Take us home.
Okay. Hello, everybody. So in my group, we talked about a little bit of like public health and urban planning. What came to my mind was the equity picture where the grass is uneven. And a good example of that is today we're still seeing the results, right? It's generation through generation. One of the things we talked about in our groups was the placement of low-income apartments. They're more exposed to like pollution since they're next to the freeways, as well as commuting. I know that in the Bay Area, people can commute from like Sacramento and Tracy, and that just it broadens the spectrum. It like widens the lens of why do we have to do this, and just really focuses on the race inequality.
Yeah.
And the opportunities presented to us.
Yeah, where land use policies, it's why I got into planning, right, are huge. If we think about the Bay Area, what's the difference between the 580 and the 880, if you know about that part of the Bay at all, the East Bay?
We talked about that a little bit in our group.
Yeah. So you can drive trucks down the 880, but you can't drive them down the 580. What are the impacts of having hundreds, thousands of semi-trucks driving through a community every single day to the lungs of the kids that live in that community, right? To just overall health, air quality, and who lives along the 880? People of color, right? People historically and currently. And that's a public policy. That's a land use policy, because folks in the hills and along the 580 had political power and access to, institutions that they could say, no semis coming down our through our neighborhood, right? So much to say. Okay. So I want to make sure that we leave you all with a couple of tools and skills that you can bring back, because we know the knowledge is just one part of it. It's also we are humans who are experiencing the world right now. And so let me share my screen again. One of the practices that we're extremely committed to at the Justice Collective is mindfulness. Mindfulness is a practice that not only helps you mitigate for your own biases, it helps you be a better communicator. It helps you consider, and empathize and think about the perspectives of others before maybe responding or forming, an opinion that you're going to communicate. But also, it's a tool. Your body is a resource that you always have access to, right? And particularly when we're thinking about the communities that many of you are serving who may not always have a place to sleep, but they always have their bodies, right? And so when you're in the trenches, which I know work is super stressful and hard for many of you right now, we want to offer this practice as one that you can tap into. And so what we're going to invite everyone to do is get comfortable in your seat, whatever that looks like or means for you. If you want to turn your video off, you can. And when you're ready, we want you to go ahead and let your eyes close. And take a few deep breaths here, just feeling yourself in the chair, listening to the sound of your breath, the sensation of it entering and leaving your lungs. And as you sit here quietly, I want you to start to tap into what the soles of your feet feel like. Are they sitting on the ground, underneath you? Do you have socks on? Maybe you'll wiggle your toes a little bit. Just remind your toes that they're there. Just notice them. Notice what they feel like. And now I want you to bring your attention up to your ankles and your calf muscles. Maybe they're a little tense, sitting all day. Maybe twist your ankles around in a few circles and just loosen them up a bit. Think about flexing and extending your foot and releasing some of that tension in your calf muscles. Few more deep breaths here, and I want you to start to bring your attention further up. Feel the seat on your bum. Start to check in with your lower back. We're all doing a lot of sitting at computer screens these days. So I want you to take a few deep breaths specifically into your lower back. See if you can really oxygenate those muscles there. Maybe you want to turn to your right and to your left a little bit, get a little movement in your spine. I want you to take another deep breath as you bring your attention up to your middle back and your rib cage. So think of hugging both sides and just really fill your lungs with oxygen. If you feel your rib cage expand and contract, maybe you want to lean back a little bit and let your mid back crack oftentimes, or stretch a bit. If again you want to turn, to the right and to the left, give yourself some movement there. I want you to take another deep breath and bring your attention to your shoulders and to your neck. And so a lot of us bring and carry stress, tension there. And so maybe you're going to roll your shoulders or tilt your head from side to side and give a little bit of space there. Maybe shrug your shoulders and let them drop. Really try and relax your shoulders. I want you to bring your attention to your face. Are you holding any tension in your cheeks? Maybe let your jaw relax and move it from side to side a few times. A couple more deep breaths here. And if you're furrowing your brow like I do almost every other minute of the day, go ahead and release that tension in your forehead. And on your last few deep breaths, we want you to envision there's a string pulling from the top of your head into the sky, and just really try and sit up straight if you can and lengthen your spine and just really feel yourself being pulled towards the sky. And just take a few more deep breaths on your own time here. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes back up and join the room back. All right. And so mindfulness, again, it's a practice in slowing down, right? In what is often feels like an impossible scenario to slow down, right? There's always another crisis. There's always someone who needs you. But it only took us 2 minutes to really slow down. How do all of you feel? Was that good? Is that like, every time I do it, I'm like, I should do this every day. I should do this a few times a day, right? And so if you find yourself having to get into, a challenging conversation, or in the middle of a conflict, or, some other, hard moment, right? If you can, just take a couple minutes. If you're about to have a hard conversation to give some feedback that might be challenging for someone to receive, invite them to sit with you for a minute and just take a few deep breaths together, so that you're both present in the moment, able to maybe shake off a little bit of what you brought into the room. And then you can have maybe a more present and mindful conversation. And so I'm going to move through this content. We only have a few minutes left, and so you're going to get these slides. If you join us for another training, certainly have an opportunity to bring them back. But just briefly, emotional intelligence and empathy are really critical skills for you to be effective at equity, diversity, inclusion, right? They're effective. They're essential for you to create good organizational culture, right? I'm sure we've all interacted with leaders, or maybe we are leaders ourselves, who have room to grow related to to emotional intelligence and empathy. And so the difference between the two is that emotional intelligence is how you understand and are able to navigate your emotions and the emotions of others, right? And so it's about understanding and then navigating that. And I'll talk more about exactly what that means. Empathy is your ability to feel with people. It's your ability to identify with what they are feeling and experience the emotions that they are feeling, right? The good thing about both of these is that if they're not inherent to you, they are things that you can intentionally work on and grow skill around them, right? And so your ability to understand others' emotions, you can practice that, right? Your ability to empathize with others, you can practice that as well. It's not easy work, but it is lifelong work. And it's work that you have to be extremely intentional when you're doing it, right? The other thing I'll just mention is the recognition that there's a lot of neurodiversity in our world. And so for folks who may bring, a different, be neuroatypical in some way, some of these might be more challenging, right? And that's okay. But just acknowledging that we do have an opportunity to consider both of these as tools in our practice of being and working and collaborating with other people. And so just briefly, there are a few aspects of emotional intelligence. There's our awareness of self. So how am I feeling right now? What do I need right now? There's how we then manage that feeling, that emotion, right? There's how aware we are of where others are currently, and then how we then navigate based on our own understanding of where we are and our own understanding of where others are and what their needs are. And so we're all doing these things all the time, right? As we're in conversation, as we're arguing, as we're solving problems together, we're all doing this all the time. But having a deeper understanding of where you're really strong and where you might not necessarily be as strong is a really potentially transformative piece of knowledge for you, right? And so one of the things I recognized is my own self-awareness is where I had an opportunity to grow. And it's because I was spending so much time worrying about where others were and what they needed, and then also managing whatever was going on with me. I wasn't quite sure, but I knew I needed to not express it in the way that I was feeling it, right? As a Black woman, I can't be mad at the situation. I can't express my anger, right? Because then what will everyone think, right? And so just an opportunity to consider the way that these things show up based on our own identities, where we are in the hierarchy of our organizations, all of those sorts of things. And so much more to say about this, and we'll look for opportunities to do so. We're not going to do the breakout today because we only have a couple of minutes. What we want to do, though, is there will be a hyperlink to an evaluation placed in the chat box. Your perspectives are valuable to us. If you are joining us for training 2, we'll be excited to dig deeper into shared language and how we can think about things like emotional intelligence in the context of our identity. And we have like 1 minute, but we appreciate you spending your part of your day with us. Sarah, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to invite everyone to look at this time together across all these different organizations, that there's such an opportunity to build on this experience for collective impact. And I know that's like a goal of Destination Home, to convene all of you. And so this is sort of the beginning of that. Because there's such divergent journeys for equity, diversity, and inclusion within all of your organizations, that there is a invitation to share resources. If someone's like, how do I get better at hiring? Some organization here today might have already crossed that bridge and has some resources that they could share, for example. So it's just a really powerful opportunity. We often do like one organization training. So doing a multi-organization training like this really underscores that goal of Destination Home.
All right. Thank you all so much. Feel free to reach out, and we'll make sure that you have all the materials from today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.